in this book, what fascinated me is the author's sensibility to time of day, to the weather especially. He's always talking about the weather. A little disappointed we don't have 1,000 weathers today. I mean, there's all these grades of weather he's talking about. I mean, on every page it seems to me he's talking about the weather, and often how that affects his body. And you know, Nietzsche was hypersensitive to, you know, and just a slight change in drop of barometric pressure, he'd be laid out for 72 hours. So yes, I can see that there is that divergence, and certainly Nietzsche does want to stay, you know, more sort of fully anchored in the body. And yet, maybe there's definitely a lot in this book where you see, you know, and maybe it's because it's sort of an unpleasant connection sometimes between the weather and and so on.
That's good news then. I think you should, because when people read Pessoa, he's criticized often for having no connection with the body in a special sense, because of his imaginary existence.
Yes.
And so I think you should bring
I'll
out the corporeal element and his sensitivity to the world around him and within. Sort of.
Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, what I'd like to do is just, if I may, and then this will be I've got two more things to say. Is that okay if I say these and then I'll go on? The first is that handout you have, that in a sense this is my picture, it's the only diagram I've ever made philosophically, but it seemed to be important, of how this works in Nietzsche. That is, for Nietzsche, where do these personalities come from? Where does this multiplicity of persons come from? And I think this diagram is my attempt to show where. That is that for Nietzsche there is nothing but drives. You know, he says. I mean, again, this is an aspect of Nietzsche that most Nietzsche scholars seem totally uninterested in. It seems to me to be vitally important when he says, by the way, we don't know anything about what's going on with us, you know, let alone the world, but because our drive life, our Triebleben, is almost completely shut off from us. We just get glimmers here and there, you know, little bubbles bursting on the surface that come into consciousness, which philosophers seem to be very interested in. There are whole institutes studying consciousness. Nietzsche says consciousness is a surface. It's pathetically, it's just social. It's just it's another construct, and is absolutely superficial. And he says about the Europeans, they have far too much consciousness. In fact, from looking at the Europeans, we see consciousness is a sickness. So how do we get better? How do we become convalescent? As I see, it's an interesting theme in Pessoa, is for Nietzsche to understand what's beneath consciousness is this play of multiple drives that, and the trieb is you say, well, what is that exactly? Is that a psychological term, or is it a physiological term? Or is it, you know? Well, it's neither. It undercuts any of those distinctions. But it certainly, if we weren't embodied, we wouldn't have drives. So it's more somatic in its origins, and they come from what I'm calling the archaic heritage. They come from the body, the bodies that we are inherited from all the way back to the Big Bang. In fact. So there are, as I see it, several levels on which these drives play themselves out, and they appear, when we do become aware of them, they appear as images. And at the first level, elemental images of earth, water, fire, and air. And I have a chapter in the book on that level. And you see these arrows that go faint to the left and then go off to the right are meant to suggest drives working on other drives, because that's how it all works for Nietzsche. The drives are working with or against, inhibiting, suppressing other drives all the time. And that for us to be working with the elements, with natural, what's given naturally, can produce works of plastic art, not poetry, but sculptures and paintings and so on. Then there's the level, it's sort of an Aristotelian thing, Aristotle does this in De Anima. Then there's the vegetal soul. So Aristotle didn't have an elemental soul, it's clear that Nietzsche does. And I think Pessoa does, because the weather is matched by, you don't have weather without a landscape or a cityscape. And full of landscapes. He's always imagining, as I said at the beginning, the characters come from these landscapes in the non-existent Portugal within his soul. And lots and lots of landscapes that he says he dreams as clearly, as plainly as so-called real ones. So there's a vegetal level that Aristotle starts to be interested in, and the working of that gives you agriculture, and for Nietzsche there's a lot of animal husbandry going on, there's a lot of horticultural metaphors, we are trees, we are plants, and we can work with that. If you're a gardener, if you know what you're doing, pruning is a really good thing. From the outside it looks like inflicting violence on the plant, but a good horticulturalist, a good gardener, is able to prune, to cut off life at the right time, at the right place, in order for life to burgeon, for the plant to burgeon. And a lot of farming metaphors in animal husbandry to do with the soul in Nietzsche, and there's a chapter dedicated to that. Then you've got animals, and I don't mean this to be a sort of, actually, although in a sense it's from Aristotle, I don't mean this to be an Aristotelian hierarchy. It's not that we're getting better as we go up, we're just getting more complex and complicated. I mean, think of, the animal soul is an advance for Aristotle on the vegetal soul, but think of it from the point of view of the vegetable. I mean, the vegetable's looking at the sheep and the cows. What a life! You spend your whole time down like this and chomping away, and then you have to move. I mean, it's all plant, locomote. They don't need to. They would see it as a real sort of aberration and a degeneration, and you have to move around to get your food. You can say, okay, but then the plants get eaten by animals, but of course they want to be eaten by animals, because then they can propagate themselves. There's some wonderful books. There's a fellow, Michael Pollan, Pollan, who's written wonderful things about plants from the plant's point of view. And if you see it from that perspective, then being an animal is kind of stupid and a waste of time, boring. So then we have the breeding and training of animals. So often the drives are imagined as these monsters, incredibly powerful, and Nietzsche's always saying, be careful what you do with them. Don't lose in the economy of the soul, the oikos, the household of the soul. Those energies are important. Just because they're scary doesn't mean we can't deal with them. The last thing we want to do is slaughter them or cut them off or whatever. But we want to do a little animal husbandry, we want to do a little breeding, we certainly want to do zucht, we want to züchtigen, train. We might need some forceful methods, but if we can, I don't see these animals so much in this book anyway, so he seems less interested. And then we get up to the human level, and we have procreation at the level of eros and a whole sort of libidinal economics. And I think Nietzsche follows Plato a lot in this, that you find Eros operating throughout the cosmos. All of this will to power. I mean, these multiple drives are what Nietzsche calls will to power. It's the world as will to power, and our bodies as local configurations of will to power. And I think a lot of it taken from Plato and the idea of sublimation that Nietzsche uses. The ultimate goal is different from Plato's, because when you get to the soulless household, and then you get this, now the drives, the images, they're imagining themselves as persons, and then the question arises, how do we organize this multiplicity? Because for Nietzsche, if there isn't a regime of some sort, then it's going to be chaos. We know people like that, just unreliable, whatever. I suppose the aesthetic stage for Kierkegaard is just follow your instincts and your bliss and so on. For Nietzsche follows Plato, I think, in saying we need a regime, but what kind of regime? And where Plato says, well, we have to have an aristocracy of reason. We have to have reason dominated through the middle, the warrior class, the most the spirited part of the soul. We can't have the drives, the animal drives, the many-headed beast and so on in Plato. We don't want to tame it, otherwise we lose the energy from the libidinal economy. But we want to train it. Training without taming, I think, is his maxim. But for Nietzsche, an aristocracy of reason, I mean, for Nietzsche there is no hierarchy between reason and the passions, because reason is simply a configuration of the passions. He says that several times. What we call reason is simply a relationship of some drives to others, and this is very like Spinoza. So it's not that we can't even identify a leader, we've just got all these drives, and the question is, how are they to order themselves? How can they be ordered themselves? For Nietzsche would say, for Plato would be going for maximum serenity, a life of order and apple-line measure and so on. Nietzsche, of course, a lot more Dionysian, or at least balance the apple-line with the Dionysian, because what he's after is a life of maximum creativity. And for that, you need what I've called serial tyranny by committee. That is, you have these various groups of drives that dominate, and they change over time, different stages in your life. And eventually, you end up in the Twilight of the Idols with the figure of Goethe, who disciplined, a man of exquisite culture, who also was natural. Natural scientist in some sense of the word. He disciplined himself into a totality. There was nothing left out. He managed to get it all together. And he was able eventually to relax and grant himself, to dare to grant himself the full range of nature and naturalness. And this is Taoism and Zen, absolutely all the way. And I think the most interesting part of, so the culmination of Nietzsche's ideas about the drives and the multiplicity is, the answer is Selbstbeherrschung, of course necessary for a long time, but only, he says, as a means to an end. You need the discipline, and as long as you need it, which is in many cases a long time, but when you manage to get it together, and he uses various metaphors of the theater troupe, the musicians playing together. You don't need a conductor, you don't need a director. As long as we all know each other, all these friends of Pessoa, as long as they know each other, then at the Goethe stage, you could say, now we can let go, and the drives are all familiar enough with themselves, they've worked it out, and here's who we are, each of us.